Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.
Marking the 10th anniversary of the end of combat operations in Afghanistan and 3 years since the evacuation of Kabul. This series brings us personal accounts of those who were there. Just over 150,000 UK Armed Forces personnel served in Afghanistan. These true life experiences have been difficult to talk about. They tackle challenging issues and may be emotionally difficult to hear. If you feel you may be sensitive to this, you may prefer not to listen.
Welcome to Land, Sea and Air. I'm Steve Bomford, co-founder of Company of Makers.
And I'm Tip Cullen, an actor and former Royal Marines Commando.
So on this episode, we talk to Bronwyn Royce, and I think the best way to describe this tip is it's a mother's tale.
I think mums are the most sacred being to every person on earth. So I really want to listen to Bronwyn's story. And I know Cayle personally, so I'm looking forward to this.
Bronwyn, I just want to say thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast and tell what I think is quite a challenging story, but with some quite positive outcomes, I think.
Thank you for having me. Yes, it is a very challenging story, but lots of positives to be taken from it, from where we were to where we are now, days in the hospital to adventures across the world now. My child has come a long way,
A seamless link there. So your child is Cayle.
He is, yes.
He was in the British Army and got injured, and this is one of the things that we're here to talk about today, and then what he's done subsequently, having left the service. So I think, like any good story, we should begin at the beginning. And obviously this is your perspective on all of this, and as a mother going through some pretty serious challenges, I think. But first of all, let's talk about Cayle a little bit. What was he like as a boy? Was he as adventurous as he turned out?
Oh my gosh, yes. He's before he could even walk, he was adventurous. He was into everything. He was so inquisitive about everything. He was climbing. He was throwing balls. He was just wanting to do everything. He was always out to find out what the world is all about.
You know, as he grew up and I guess he decided he wanted to join the army, did that come as a surprise to you?
Not really, because his grandfather, his father, his uncle, who he's very close to, they'd all been in the military and they'd all spoken about it. And Cayle hung on every single word. Every time they told a story, he'd ask, especially Uncle Keith, can you tell me that story again? His father had him march up and down the road trying to show him how, the marching was done, when he was little. He wasn't sort of 5 or 6 years old and he was learning how to march already. So, it's not a career you'd wish, or I would have wished for my child, but I always had a feeling that he was going to go into it somewhere along the line. At the time, we thought it would be in South Africa, but there was no future for him in the military in South Africa, which is why he ended up coming to the UK.
So tell me a bit about that. So about the joining up and how he joined the British military, because I think a lot of our listeners may not necessarily be aware of, should we say, Commonwealth countries, and people from Commonwealth countries have been able to join the British Armed Forces.
As it turns out, he came over on an ancestral visa through his father's line. But as it turns out, anybody can actually come from another country, because Cayle's best friend, who was on the ground with him when he was injured, is South African. And he had no link to the country, to the UK. And he came over, but you have so many months to join the military. And once you've joined and been accepted, then you can stay in. For Cayle, he was fortunate in that he did come over on an ancestral visa. So once he was injured, he still had that in the background. So it's not as if he then had to move back to South Africa, because he already was then in the process of getting his British passport, which was very fortunate for him.
So tell me about joining up, because again, that was an unusual way you went about it, wasn't it?
Cayle and I had traveled a little bit, and I could hear that he was really wanting to join. And he'd been in the UK on a 2-year work holiday visa, came back to South Africa, but was very restless. He then climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, then came back from that and said, that's it, I'm going to move to the UK. I'm going to go and join the military. He joined the parachute regiment, but because Cayle is all or nothing, he'd trained extremely hard, and he suffered from severe stress fractures in his legs. And within about 8 or 9 months, it became very apparent that his legs were in a bad way, and he was stuck into quarantine and medically sorted out and everything. And eventually he was medically discharged. And he sort of floated around for about a year, 18 months, but he just wanted to get back in. Knowing the state of his legs, he didn't think that he would be able to go back to parachute regiment. So he went and joined the Light Dragoons. So that was, let me think, it must have been 2010 that he joined the Light Dragoons, and he started training then for Brigade Reconnaissance Force, which is who he deployed with was the BRF.
Okay. So not long after that, of course, world events took quite a turn, didn't they?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Afghanistan started sort of really picking up. And as much as I tried not to think about it, I had a feeling that that's what was going to be happening. He would be deploying. And then it started with all the really intense training out in Kenya. He was being moved all over the place to do all this training, and he was doing really well. You know, he was top in everything. He was the best shot. He was the best sharpshooter. He was so I mean, knowing that he was going to go out, I knew he was prepared for it. I wasn't so prepared, but I knew he was prepared. He'd done as much training as was actually possible. And so he was best equipped as he could have been for what lay ahead.
I think, like most soldiers, he was probably looking forward to putting himself to the test, and obviously putting all that training into practice.
Yes.
But what was your take on that?
If I could have, I would have said, please don't go. But I think Cayle and I have always had a very close relationship, and I think that probably would have put a wedge between us if he'd known. And even on the day he was leaving, he'd come to say goodbye to me in Dartmouth. Even on that day, I was giving a big cooked breakfast, and we were chatting over the kitchen table. And I just said, this wouldn't have been my first choice for you, but I give you my blessing. You need to go and do what you want to do. And he just said, I am so ready for this, But he was slightly older than most of the youngsters. By then he was 26 years old. So, a lot of these guys go out and they're sort of 18, 19. Some of them is very young. Whereas I knew Cayle had done quite a lot with his life already, and his head was really in it. He was so keen to get out there.
Okay, so did you have much communication with him? Because, obviously this is quite a while ago, and the internet, perhaps, access to communications wasn't as good as it is now.
We did actually have a lot. The military had set up something there were e-blueies, we could email each other. So we were writing letters. I was sending a lot of hampers out to him every week. I was sending to him and his best friend, Royce. And then all the lads were stopping everything inside the hampers. Oh, you've got something here, So we had quite a lot of contact. He would message back and say, that was great, but next time, can you send this? And, this is the first time I've been on the ground today. It was so exciting and all that. So we had a lot more contact. And in fact, I was recently reading through all the emails that he was sending from Camp Bastion. And it was the one just after he'd been on the ground for the first time, and the excitement and knowing that everything he trained for, he was putting to use now for real. There was no more messing around. This was it. He was actually in war now. But he was very confident in himself.
So again, how did you feel about all that? Were you worried about that, or did you feel reassured by what he was saying?
I was reassured by what he was saying. And obviously, there's always this thing, he's in a war zone. I mean, the possibility of anything happening is, I wouldn't say it's relatively high, but it's there. But you always think, it's never going to happen to me, but why not? Why shouldn't it happen to us as a family? The chances are very high of it happening to anybody out there. Why not us? And so when it did happen, I mean, a lot of people have looked at us and said, gee, you've handled it quite well. Well, what you actually going to do about it? It's done. There's nothing you can do about it now. So, yeah, I was worried about him.
Which sounds perfectly normal. I mean, I hear what you're saying in terms of the chances may not be that high, but nonetheless, you don't know that for sure, do you? So there's bound to be some anxiety as a mother, I would have thought.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, every day, I was thinking, okay, we've got through another day. I haven't heard anything, and certainly prayed like crazy for this kid, because you just don't know. You have no idea what's going to happen, and not being there and not hearing. And the messages I was getting back from him were positive, understandably. He didn't want me to be more concerned than I already was. So, yeah.
So, unfortunately, things did take a turn for the worse. How did you find out about that? Well,
I'd had the most amazing day at work that day. I don't know why I was feeling on top form, and after work I was going off to the gym, walked through Dartmouth along the front, looked at all the boats and everything, got to the gym, and I was going to go swimming with a friend. But when I got there, I had such a strong feeling that something was wrong. Anyway, I got in the pool, I swam a couple of lengths, and I just said to her, sorry, I need to go home. And she said, no, why? Come for supper tonight. I said, no, I just need to go home. And she said, has something happened? I said, I actually don't know. And I went back home, went into my flat, climbed up all these stairs and everything, sat on my sofa, opened my laptop, put the television on, put it on mute, and I just sat there and I just waited. And I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I just waited. And when I heard the knock on the doorbell rang, and the strange thing is that that doorbell hadn't worked in the 2 years that I'd lived in the flat. There'd been no batteries. And the week before, I'd gone and put batteries in the doorbell. And I heard the doorbell go, and I sat for a bit, and then I stood up. The doorbell went again, and I stood in the kitchen, and I thought, I know what this is. And on the third time, I went down the stairs, and it was a sort of cottage pane glass door, and I could see the two gentlemen standing outside, suited up, and I knew what it was. And I looked through the door, and I said, is he still alive? And they just stared at me. The taller chap just stared at me. He said, can you open the door? I said, can you tell me, is he still alive? And he said, yes, can you open the door? It was almost as if I'd been prepared. I didn't know what for, but I'd been prepared that there was going to be some really bad news about my child. They said, would I go back upstairs? Can I call somebody, come and sit with me? And to me, it was such a personal thing that I wanted to do it on my own. And I said, I'd rather hear for myself. And they said, no, can you call somebody? We need this. And I said, no, it's fine. I'll take it on my own. And interestingly enough, I've seen the report since, and they didn't tell me everything. And obviously they were concerned of, how I was going to react to what they were saying. And as soon as they'd given me the basics, they said, is there somebody that you can phone? And I said, yeah, I need to phone Seth. So I phoned my youngest son, who was also in the military at the time. He was in the Royal Marines, and he was doing a Pashto language course. I phoned Seth, and he was in a coffee shop with a friend. And he answered the phone. He went, Mother dearest. And I said, Sethi. And he literally said, when's he coming home? Because he also knew. Anyway, so he then drove home to me, and then I phoned Cayle's father, who was in France, told him what had happened. And then the officers then said, okay, now we need somebody to come and sit with you. And I said, no, it's fine. You can go now. I'll be fine. Seth's going to drive home. He'll be with me later tonight. And that's it. They said, we'll wait outside for half an hour in the car, and if you need us, we'll come back. But we prefer if you call somebody. And yeah, I just literally just sat on the sofa, and I thought, what do we do now? Not knowing the actual state. All they'd said to me was that Cayle had lost one leg. There was a high chance he would lose the other one, but he was in surgery in Camp Bastion at the time. And that's pretty much what they told me. So now in my head is going through, what am I going to see when I see my child? Is it just going to be that he has one leg left, or is there going to be more to it? And obviously, as you know, the hours in the day, the next morning went on, we started to find out that there was a lot more involved, you know. So yeah, once Seth got to me, we started to put pieces together, and Cayle's friend who was in Afghanistan with him ended up phoning, and I put him onto speakerphone, and he spoke to Seth and I, and because he was with Cayle at the time, and he then gave his side of the story and told us. So we already knew that Cayle was going to be in a much worse state than what we'd first thought.
It sounds to me like, as you and as a family with Seth, you were very calm about this. Almost, it's not always the kind of reaction certainly it's not the reaction I expect, having never been through anything like this. So you seem to have been very calm. Like you said, there's almost like a preparedness there. How do you look back on that?
It is the strangest thing. And where did that peace come from? Because, you know, when I look back on it now, if I'd been in a flat spin and flapped, and it would actually have helped nobody. And I can understand that that's how a lot of people react in a situation like that. But it was a piece that I don't understand, that literally just covered us. I mean, there's no two ways about it. I was in a real state inside, but I was trying not to show that on the outside. But that not knowing, having said goodbye to my child 5 weeks before, this big, strong lad, and now thinking, what am I going to see when I see him again? By that stage, and by the next day, we knew that Cayle's left hand had been very badly injured, and we knew that his face had been blown up as well. Now, you trying to picture, so what does it mean his face has been blown up? You know, there's no reference to go by now. So in your mind, you can make it worse or you can make it better. I just tried to keep that calm. I basically, because Seth and I were collected by a driver and driven up to Birmingham to go and wait for Cayle. And sitting in the car, I gave Seth my phone. I said, you're going to have to deal with this. And just listening to him speaking, he was so calm about it. And that helped me. And whether that was the military training in him or whether he also had this piece about him, I'm not sure. Probably in a way, it was good that we didn't have all the details of the injuries, because it would have been worse. You know, what on earth are we going to actually see when we get there? Yeah.
So what did you see when you got there?
Wow. Way more shocking than what we had thought was going to be. Cayle was blue lighted in, and we were standing in the hospital looking out and watching, you know, the whole time, because you know that his injuries are so severe. It's also thinking, is he still going to be alive by the time they get him there? Because it was like 6:30 in the evening. He'd been injured the day before. So, you know, all this time with these really severe injuries, seeing the blue lights so it was 2 motorbikes, ambulance, police cars and everything come in. Is the strangest thing is thinking immediately, well, the lights are still flashing, the sirens are going, he's got to be alive. Otherwise, that wouldn't be happening. So that was like, okay, so sure, that's all right. So he's still alive. And then waiting, we got called in quite a while later, actually. We got called into a sort of consulting room. And then the guys of the helicopter came in, and they were telling us, you know, what it sort of given us a bit of a breakdown of what was going on and how Cayle had been a bit awake during the time, which everybody found quite astounding. They were all saying your child's the most incredible fighter. You know, he shouldn't be alive with what's happened to him. And then they were then going to hand over to the medical staff in the hospital. And as they were leaving, the one chap turned around and he said to me, oh, you probably want these. And he handed me Cayle's dog tags. And that was just taking those from him and thinking, well, there's still 2 discs on the chain. It was just such a strange thing. And the noise of that, because I immediately put it around my neck. And for the next, while Cayle was in his coma, I had this jingle all the time. I wore that on my neck the whole time. And then we were given the proper breakdown by all the consultants at Queen Elizabeth Hospital of what to expect. They'd obviously assessed him, and they were waiting to take him into surgery after we'd seen him. And then they asked, would we like to see him? And walking in to ITU and knowing what I'd seen my child to be, and then walking in, and he was literally completely shrouded up to just underneath his eyes closed, and then seeing the sheet across him, and then just absolutely nothing where his legs were, such strong legs. And in a way, they were sort of slowly showing us what was going on with Cayle, because we literally were given a few minutes. I was allowed to go around to his head, kissed his forehead, and as I pulled away, I just happened to look, and I could see underneath the sheet, and I could see his face was completely, it looked like thinly sliced meat. I mean, it was just completely shredded underneath. And then we were taken away and told to go and leave, and that they would contact us after they'd done the first lot of operations. And when we went back after midnight that night, the sheet had been dropped, and so much more of Cayle was visible, and the extent of the injuries, you could clearly see where his body armor had been and where it hadn't, because where it sort of protected his chest, his arms were blown open. You could see that most of his left hand was missing. He'd lost the top of all his fingers and his thumb and everything. That was all gone. His face was blown. His lips had been blown off completely. His mouth had been sliced on the left side, and almost lost his left eye. Just trying to absorb that is so difficult, How is that from that child who we laughed and waved and, oh, don't worry, I'll be fine, Mum, to seeing this, but knowing already them saying, your kid is such a fighter, and I'm just believing in him and with him that you're going to pull through. And then having to leave the hospital and think, is this it? Are we going to get a call now and say, sorry, he didn't make it, but he fought right from the beginning. He fought. He was such a fighter.
So before we go on to that, what actually happened to him? I mean, what was the incident? Did you know more by now? Did you get more information about that?
We'd had a bit of information from Royce, Cayle's friend, who'd been on the ground with him, and he'd explained that they'd found a lot of IED components from the Taliban, and they'd blown all that up, and it had made a massive bang. Okay, and the Cayle's guys had access to that, so they could hear what the Taliban were talking about. And obviously the radio started chattering and everything, and these guys like, oh, they've blown up our stuff and everything. And obviously they were then on a mission to find Cayle's guys, and that's what happened. So they were trying to get out of the area, going down an irrigation ditch, and it just got tighter and tighter and tighter, stinky water and everything. So Cayle was at that stage third in line, and Shorty, his commander, climbed out first. He was the guy with the helmet camera. He climbed out first. I'm trying to think who was next. The guy, sorry, I can't remember his name. He climbed out second, and Cayle was the third out. And the other two had stepped on the IED, but because it was meant for a vehicle, so it was a 20-kilogram IED as opposed to a normal sort of 5 to 8-kilogram IED, it was such a big bang. Cayle was carrying a lot of weight on his back, carrying lots of ammunition and stuff. And it was because he was so heavy when he stepped on it. That's why it went off. Thankfully for all of us, not so much his mother, it was being filmed, and that has helped him a lot now to piece everything together. But yeah, it was a mighty big bang, huge big hole in the ground and everything. But his guys were straight on him. I mean, it was just incredible. They saved his life, basically, got onto him straight away, tourniqueted him and got him into the Chinook and got him out of there. So, yeah.
So he was lucky to be alive, to put it mildly, wasn't he, at that point? And as you say, the medical staff were saying that he's clearly a fighter, because he was indeed lucky to be back in the UK, I think. So you've tried to process and come to terms with what you've seen in the hospital. What's the sort of medical action now that you're being told is going to happen, and how do you feel about all of that?
So they were pretty good in filling us in on everything and saying we're not going to hold anything back. And if you want to know more, then just ask the questions, which was quite interesting. And I wanted to know everything. I knew I'm not medically trained at all, but every time I went into ITU to see Cayle, the first thing I do is start scanning all the machines around to try and read, well, hang on, our temperatures up, temperatures down, this, trying to piece everything together, asking lots of questions and things, because I wanted to know what was going on. I wanted I always felt like I could give him the best chance if I was on top of it. But being from South Africa, I've got 4 siblings. I've got a brother and 3 sisters. And I think in hindsight, a lot of people thought I was sort of a little bit removed from the situation. But I'd started writing in a little diary, and I was mainly writing down all these figures and things because I knew I needed to pass the information on to people. And the best way to do that would be to write it all down. And then what happened was I'd started to write emails from the hospital every second night, just to give people, people were messaging and phoning. And then I think, have I told them this, or who did I tell that? And it just seemed to be the most logical way of doing it. And also because we would go in to see Seth and I and our friend Rich Baker and Cayle's dad, Richard, would go in together to see the consultants every time Cayle had an operation. And they obviously would give you so much information. And we would leave there and I would jot down a few things. And then I'd ask the guys, okay, what did you remember out of this? So they were very open in saying, okay, now what you can see has happened to Cayle is horrendous, right? So you can see he's now missing both legs. At that stage, one of his legs was below knee amputation, the other one was above. But because he was in water at the time of injury and because of the Afghan dirt, they eventually actually had to cut his leg higher. But they were very open with us. We've had to take a scrubbing brush and scrub the end of his stump, and everything. And I'm not very good with things like that. But because I knew I needed to take it all in, I was okay with it. Now, somebody cuts their finger, I fall over. But with Cayle, I had to be as strong as I possibly could for him, and that's what I did. We had a few moments where the one time I passed out, just looking at this and thinking, strangely enough, mainly at his left hand, because he had beautiful, strong hands, and thinking, I think he's going to struggle more without the use of his left hand than he is without the use of his legs. As it turns out, that has been pretty much the case. But yeah, coming to terms with, and they operated a lot, but then telling us, you can see there's a lot of physical injuries, but actually what's going on inside his body is worse than what you can actually physically see, if that's possible. So we could start to see over the weeks the healing to the physical wounds that we could see. But the inside of him, his lungs started to harden because it was such a big blast when he was blown up, when he stepped on the IED. Basically, his lungs compressed so quickly and then expanded again. And they within days, the bruising came out. And so they started to harden. So actually, it was his breathing that ended up being more of a problem than what we could see. And his heart was quite badly bruised. So that was really hard to take in, as if there's not enough going on the outside. How can there still be more going on the inside? And that, as the weeks went on, that's what was harder for us to accept, because physically he was healing so quickly. It was remarkable. All the medical staff were saying, we've never seen anything like this. It's just unbelievable. And yet 3 times we were called in to say goodbye to Cayle, weeks down the line, because it was his lungs that was the problem. And that was really hard to understand, but he's looking so good. It looks like everything's fine, but inside his body was just, really having a battle.
So am I right in thinking he was put into a medically induced coma as well? Is that?
He was.
And so tell me a little bit about that, because you're talking about these events, but I'm assuming that he was in a coma for a lot of this.
Yeah. So he was put into a medically induced coma straight away as soon as he got to the hospital, and he was in a coma for 48 days. In all that time, they would try and drop his sedatives and try and let him come out. He has no recollection of those times. Sometimes he seemed to be smiling. Sometimes he would wink and all that, but he doesn't remember any of that. But then mainly his lungs inside would cause another problem, and then they would have to put him back under again and leave him in this sedative state because his body just wasn't coping. Because he was such a fighter, he was probably trying to do it all himself instead of letting nature take its course and do its healing. So 48 days he was in a coma. It's a long time.
And it was during that time that you were asked potentially that he may not survive, and that's when you had to, as you put it, say goodbye. Yeah,
so 3 times that happened. I didn't believe that, as much as obviously I raced to the hospital every time. I never doubted that my child was going to make it, except one split second, literally, when it was quite a few weeks down the line, and the doctor called us in and just said, listen, this is the problem. We are now going to have to put him onto an oscillator to try and help his lungs. We generally don't put people onto an oscillator for more than 3 days because, all the implications that go with it. And in that split second, I suddenly thought, is he saying that my child is not going to make it? And a second later, I was like, he is definitely going to pull through this. And he was on an oscillator a lot longer than what they expected, days longer than what they expected. And, now they've got to, because the oscillator does your breathing for you.
Yep.
So it completely holds your lungs in a state, and it does the breathing. But he kept over breathing this thing, and they had to drug him more and more and more. But that's how strong his mind was, telling him to fight the whole way through. And when we've spoken since, he said he doesn't know where it was coming from. He was just saying, I'm not going to die, I'm not going to die, I'm not going to die. Through all of that, through horrific hallucinations, through which he can recall all of that, he just kept saying, I'm not going to die. And he didn't allow himself to die.
So when he regained consciousness, I guess you were called to the hospital?
Yes, we were at the hospital every single day. But that particular day, we hadn't got in yet. And we got a call from the padre saying, you need to come in and have a chat. Oh, that was just a little bit before. You need to come in and Cayle seems to be awake. And we got there, and he was having what we've now found out was a horrific hallucination. But to me, he was talking to me. He was crying. He had a trachea in, so he couldn't speak. But he was sort of gesturing like, what is this thing above me and everything? As it turns out, unfortunately, afterwards, in his state of hallucination, he thought that this big column coming from the ceiling, which actually had all the plug points and everything to keep all the equipment keeping him alive, he thought it was a lift taking him to a crematorium and that he was about to be cut up. So, only afterwards we learned, because we couldn't work out why he was so distressed.
Yeah.
Then afterwards it came out that's what it was. So the medical staff asked us to leave. But when he did finally actually come round, I don't think we actually realized that he was, because he'd been doing these sort of pretend ones all the time, we weren't actually sure that he was alive, awake. But coming that day, Seth was actually the first one to go in and see him, and he'd been given an iPad, and Cayle wrote with his finger on the iPad, I didn't realize I'd lost both legs. And that was his first sort of realization, or our realization, that he was out of his coma, because he knew then what was happening. And that because he remembered being on the ground, remembered rolling and seeing that he still had one leg just hanging on, and hoping above everything that they'd managed to save that leg, having no idea about the state of his face or his hand or anything at that stage. All he could see was, he could only see that he'd lost both of his legs. So really difficult, all that time that Cayle was in his coma and fighting for his life and everything. I was a pretty sort of stable and coping, because I knew Cayle didn't have to see what was going on with him.
Yeah.
From the day Cayle opened his eyes, that was the end of me. Then I just cried and I was useless around him. And we had a few words because I couldn't be in the room with him because I knew how much he was struggling to come to terms with what had happened to him.
But I think also, this is probably a bit presumptuous of me. I think your persistence and your tenacity, and you talked about writing down readings, which I get, for the family, and that probably gave you some sort of sense of purpose, perhaps, that you were doing something, of course. And I think, when they do talk about this idea that people are aware that their family are there, even though they can't communicate with them. So I'm certain that you contributed to that just by sheer force of personality, if nothing else, Bronwyn.
Yeah, he does, afterwards when we spoke about things, he does know, he remembers us being there. In fact, he could work out why he thought he was still in Afghanistan. And he couldn't work out why we'd gone out there when there was war. Why would we have gone out there to see him? So he was aware that we were there, but he can't recall any of our conversations or anything over that time.
I mean, you don't, when I think of an injury like that, and obviously, from the physical perspective, it's absolutely horrific. You've got external injuries, internal injuries, but how you even begin to process that and put it back together to even understand what happened must have been quite a struggle for him.
Yes. Yeah. In a way, it's very good that he did remember what happened to him, because he's always said he knows some of the lads who were quite seriously injured. They have no recollection of what actually happened. They were injured. They remember being in Afghanistan. They were injured, and next minute they've come round in hospital. But he can remember everything that happened, and he said that's helped him process it much better, because he can put all the pieces of the puzzle together. And with all that helmet footage that was shared with him when the lads came on R&R to hospital, and they shared with him, he watched that straight away. The first day he wanted to see what had happened, and he said it was exactly what he remembered, which was in a way good for him. I've watched it once, but it's Shorty runs up to him and rolls him over, and you see everything. It's not something, and it was literally probably 2 years down the line before I watched it. And Cayle said once, and that's it. And I don't want you crying, and I did my very best. I didn't cry in front of him, but wow, to go upstairs afterwards and just absolutely sob into my pillow. But I've seen it,
Yeah, that must have been incredibly difficult. So now you as a family and Cayle are obviously on the road to recovery. What was that process like before, this is going to be a fairly drawn out and long process because of the extensive nature of his injuries. What was that like for you particularly?
Cayle he'd always been an adventurous person, but he'd always had an incredible sense of humor. And it was quite astounding how quickly that sense of humor came out, because he was obviously trying to come to terms with, the first time he looked in the mirror and saw his face, he was such a good looking boy, still is, but completely different now to deal with all of this, things going on and everything. And yet the sense of humor came out because he was so weak. He'd lost so much weight, and not only from the loss of his legs, but just because, he was a huge boy. He'd taken up the whole bed. I mean, all the nurses were literally perving over my kid, like, but he just got slimmer and slimmer and slimmer as time went on, obviously, understandably. And coming out of his coma and everything, and he made us laugh at the most ridiculous thing. I think, where's this sense of humor come from? And the one day he suddenly blurted out, he said, we sort of walked in at visiting hours, and he said, I've been sitting here thinking, okay, what's going on? He says, not only did the Taliban steal my legs, they stole my bloody whistle. Because his mouth had been blown up, he couldn't whistle. I thought, of all things, what a strange thing to say. So he used to practice whistling until somebody actually bought him a physical whistle, little metal whistle that he could whistle. But, he had it there all the time. He tried to make light of all these situations. A friend gave him a little counter And he would lie in bed, and every time a hot nurse went past, he'd click on his counter. So when we went into for visiting hours, he was, what's the totty counter on now? It was these things that made it lighter for us. Obviously, he was on his own and quietly processing things, but outwardly to us, he was helping us cope, as if to say, without, as in not as many words, I'm going to get through this.
Well, you've kind of got to do it together, haven't you? In many ways, as a family unit, you've got to do this together, because it's a difficult experience for you to go through. Putting it, understated. And I think you need to do that as a unit. How long was it before he was discharged?
So he was injured on the 2nd of May 2012. He was brought to Birmingham on the 3rd of May, and then he was discharged from QEHB on the 11th of July and sent to Headley Court for rehabilitation.
And so that must have been quite a milestone for you, being discharged to Headley Court.
Massive milestone. I mean, I was in the car with him. I asked permission to go in the car with the MLO and Cayle and everything, and driving down and watching him this is the first time away from hospital. He's now got to deal with the public. And the MLO made us stop at the services and made Cayle come out the car in his wheelchair, and we had to go and order something, and you could just see, it was really difficult for him. I just stood back, wanted to just cry, and an elderly gentleman came up and wanted to go and shake Cayle's hand and everything, and the MLO was, and the guy wanted to give Cayle money, and Cayle's like, I don't want money, and he had to take it because the guy was saying, this is his way of trying to show his appreciation for what you've done, and he found that really, really difficult. But then approaching Headley Court, I felt like I was putting my kid in boarding school, it's goodbye, off you go, it was really difficult. But I knew it was going to be literally the next step in his recovery, because he had to now move on. He had to start learning how to walk. I knew he would. A lot of these lads take a lot longer. Cayle was determined from day one he was going to recover as quickly as possible. And he went all out to become as fit as he possibly could, without me realizing that he already had a challenge in mind, which he only told us about a bit later. But yeah.
Well, you're going to have to tell me now. What plans was he hatching whilst he was doing his physiotherapy?
So while he was in hospital, Captain James Cayle, who Cayle had been with in the Light Dragoons, and Cayle had done a bit of sailing with him, came to see Cayle, and I wasn't in the room at the time. They had a little private conversation and everything. And only afterwards I learned that James had said to him, do you want to come and get on a boat with me again? And Cayle always says, I had these big dreams that we were going to be on a big sailing yacht with all these bikini-clad girls and being given a rum to drink or whatever it is. But actually, James intended him climbing in a little rowing boat and actually rowing across the Atlantic Ocean, which Cayle did 18 months after injury. So even at Headley Court, he'd approached the medical staff and just said, listen, this is what I want to do. And they refused to give him permission. And he just said, well, whether you give me permission or not, I'm still going to be doing it. So eventually he just put his hands up and said, okay, just do whatever you're going to do as long as you feel you can do it. And he did. 18 months after injury, he rode the Atlantic for the first time,
I mean, to be in hospital, let alone to get to Headley Court, and to be thinking and hatching plans like that shows an incredible strength of character, I feel.
Yeah, he is. I think he was so determined to show, people who knew Cayle pre-injury can see the same Cayle now. People who have only met him since he was injured kind of think that this hugely adventurous spirit has come out because he's trying to prove something. Well, no, he's not. He's still that same person that wants to do all these challenges. As he said, one of the really surprising things for him is that people still want him to do these things. He thought nobody would want him to join with him because of the obvious, but people still want him to do all of these things.
It's like he's reclaiming himself, isn't it? I think surely everybody reacts to these things in different ways, but it's trying to get as close as he can to the adventurous young man that he was before all this happened, of course.
Yeah. And obviously, Steve, he's he's been given opportunities now, which he wouldn't have before. And that was one of the very first things when Cayle was injured. And he had the trachea out and he could speak, and it was just him and I. And I went in and I just looked at these sad eyes and I thought, what? And he just said, Mom, what am I going to do now? And where it came from, I don't know. And I said to him, I have no idea, but doors are going to open that wouldn't have opened before. And boy, has that happened. Things are, he would have still been in the military because it would have been his life. That's what he wanted. And obviously, there's only certain things you can do while you're in the military. The things he's doing now, last year, kayaked from Seattle to Alaska, took him 89 days. He wouldn't have done that before. All these opportunities are there for him now.
So he's rowed the Atlantic a couple of times, am I right in saying?
Yeah, so the first time was with 2 able-bodied and 2 disabled soldiers. The second time was 4 disabled. So he skippered the world's first all-amputee crew across an ocean. So the first time they rowed was, very strangely enough, took them 48 days, which is the same amount of time he was in his coma. And the second time was 46 days.
Did you approve of the idea of your injured son deciding that, rowing across the Atlantic was a good idea? I mean, did that fill you with a bit of anxiety or trepidation?
Of course it did. Of course it did. Not as much as I thought it would. I think probably if I thought more about it at the time, it would have. But my initial reaction was, he's going to be able to do this. He's going to be able to do things that he thought and other people thought he wouldn't be able to do. And that, obviously I had no idea when he initially told me of what was going to be involved, how far it was, how, although it's supported as such, there's nobody with you. You're literally on a tiny little rowing boat, 4 of you rowing 3,000 kilometers across an ocean. There's a support vessel, but amongst, between all 40 or however many boats did the first one, so they're nowhere near you if something goes wrong. And I suppose I didn't have time to think about it. But then knowing physically how strong he already was, and as he said to me, this is going to be more a mental thing than a physical thing, as strange as it sounds. But when you're out there and you're in the middle of a hurricane, which they were, and they capsized on the first one and everything, to mentally be strong enough to do it, that he already was that. And that's why he was fine to do it. Physically, I knew he'd be able to do it. Obviously, if you think about rowing, you're in a sliding seat, and he couldn't be in a sliding seat because he didn't have legs. He had to be in a static seat, which means all the power is coming from his upper body having to lean forward to pull back. Whereas if you're in a sliding seat, your legs are doing the work, his back and his arms were doing the work. So much harder.
So when we first talked about this, you didn't mention that he'd capsized as well.
Yeah, he did make me laugh though, because he capsized. Him and James were they were on the paddles on the oars at the time, and the other 2 lads, was the middle of the night. The other 2 lads were obviously, in their little cabin things, and they had a lot of things on deck. They sort of battened down as much as they could because they were in a hurricane. And thankfully they were tethered to the boat. But he's quite funny because Cayle's written a lot of this book, let me just say that. So a lot of this, like I didn't row the ocean. So there's huge excerpts by Cayle. He's written huge parts of the book. But when the boat capsized, both he and James got thrown off. Cayle's head hit one of the oars, so he had a big bash on his head, broke the oar. But he said his first thought when he landed in the ocean was, wow, that's warmer than I thought. Then it was like, am I actually still tethered to the boat? And then was the realization that all their snack packs had gone into the water. So he started swimming around to go and save all his packs of biltong and everything to put them back on. James had already got back on the boat and he was trying to get Cayle back onto the boat. But he said, no, all he could see was his packs of biltong getting washed away. So,
wow. So given he knows how challenging, shall we say, rowing across the Atlantic, as he then decides to do with an all amputee crew, what was the inspiration behind that, and why why? I think that's probably what I'm trying to say.
Well, that was not his. It was not his idea at all. So that was Paddy Nicol, and Paddy had organized the first row. So he worked for Road to Recovery. He works for Invictus, actually. And he then decided, hang on now, the next best thing would to get all 4 amputees. And the only person I know who's going to be able to do this is Cayle. And so then he contacted Cayle, and Cayle was away at the time. And Paddy always makes a joke out of it and saying, oh, Cayle took so long to answer because couldn't decide whether, not another one. But actually Cayle was away, so he didn't get the email. And he thought about it and he thought, okay, same ocean again, but okay, let's give this a try. But then it was trying to find the right crew to do it with, which is it's quite a big thing. So it ended up being 4 men, 3 legs, 1 ocean is what it ended up being. So yeah, no, big thing.
So he's also been recognised, hasn't he, for his, I guess, services to charities. And you've got a great little dit, which I am going to ask you to repeat when his service was recognised.
Yes, so we were invited to Windsor Castle. By this stage, Cayle had met most of the royals, and he and Prince Harry had become quite good friends. He'd met Cayle and I had met the Queen, so we'd met the Queen and Prince Philip first. Oh, no, that's a fib. We met Prince Charles in hospital, now King Charles. Then Cayle and I were invited to meet the Queen and Prince Philip, and he'd always wanted to meet Prince Philip, and he made a little quip, which ended up being in the newspaper and everything, which Cayle loved. And of course, the media went mad with, Philip, he's made this blunder again. And Cayle's like, that's exactly what I wanted him to do. So we got through that. And now we are going to Windsor Castle, and you don't know beforehand who's going to be doing the ceremony. And so as we're approaching, it's Seth, Cayle's dad, Richard, and myself, and Cayle's driving. And we're now approaching Windsor. We're trying to see, is it going to be the Queen? Is the flag up, the flag downward? No, we got no idea. Get there. They were making a joke. And as we got to the gate, we asked, who is it? And William is the only one Cayle hadn't met. So that was really exciting. Oh, yeah, it's Prince William and everything. We go inside. Cayle has to go his way. We go our way. Now, you're not allowed to clap. You're not allowed to speak. You're not allowed to do anything. We're sitting halfway back. So it's Richard, Seth, and myself sitting in a row. Halfway back. We've got a program. You can see when Cayle's going to come. Looking towards the front, it's all quiet. Prince William's standing in the middle. He's got somebody to the left-hand side who's now announcing everybody who's coming through and everything. And I'm bobbing in my seat because I know Cayle's coming. And I can see he walks across. Seth's going, shush, Mum, stop making such a noise, because you're not allowed to make a noise. And then we see Cayle walk across, and then he turns to face William. But then he does the strange thing, which I always call it like a soft shoe shuffle. He steps backwards a couple of steps, then he steps forward, then he steps back a couple of steps, then he steps forward, and then you can see William says something to him, and then there's this sort of noise, and then we see Cayle holding onto William's arm, and then the ceremony carries on, and we've got no idea. All the front row is now chuckling, and we've got no idea what's going on, no microphones or whatever. Can't wait to find out. So after it's all over with, we go to the side. I said to Cayle, what was it about? Why were you going backwards and forwards? He says, because the pile of the carpet was so thick that on his prosthetic legs, he couldn't balance. So he was trying to get his balance. So eventually William leaned forward and said, are you okay? Can I help? And he said, no, well, your carpet's fucking me up. So William had to give him his arm to hold on to. I said, Cayle, you didn't say that to Prince William. He said, I did. He said, he laughed. Oh, gosh, yeah.
And it was an MBE he was awarded, wasn't it?
It was an MBE, yes, yeah.
So one of the things you said earlier on in this is that, from this tragic accident, the accident that happened whilst he was deployed, it's opened up another world of opportunities that perhaps he would never have had access to. Given that's quite a high price to pay for that access, I think. How do you reflect upon that?
It is a high price to pay, obviously. What I've always said to people, because people initially, especially, were very unsure of how to handle us, even as a family, let alone Cayle on his own. As a family, what are you going to say and all that? And a lot of people used to say to me, how do you cope? And it's such a silly thing to say, but you just have to. What are your options? Me falling apart and crying all the time, which I do in private, but it's not going to change anything. So if we can be as positive as we can about where we are now and the incredible opportunities that Cayle is offered, and he doesn't take them all up. There's a lot of things which he says, that's not for me. Looking at those things is what keeps me going. The fact that he hasn't struggled seriously with PTSD, he hasn't completely gone into a shell and said, leave me alone, I don't want to see anybody, don't come to my house, don't visit, he's still looking for adventures. He's still planning things to this day. That's what keeps me going. I definitely have low moments, and we are years down the line now. We 12 years post-injury, and I still will see somebody in a wheelchair and suddenly I'll be in tears, or do something and say, Cayle will never be able to do this, and I have to remember, no, Cayle can't go walking along a coast path for hours and hours like I can. But Cayle can row an ocean, which I would say I can't, but I won't. Cayle will do things that I won't do. So I've got to look for those positives in all of this, all these incredible opportunities that he gets given, which, doors have opened that wouldn't have opened before. And that's exactly what we were hoping for,
And I think his determination has earned those opportunities as well, post the injury. But I just want to pick up on what you said there. I'm not going to say I can't row the ocean. I'm going to say I won't row the ocean. And I think that says so much about you, in the sense that your determination, your stoicism, to use a very British word, I think, it comes out very, very strongly in how you tell this story. And I think that's probably no small part as to why Cayle has achieved so much that he has since his injury.
Yeah, possibly. I know we're a very tight family. I mean, I have to say here, Steve, I've got through a lot of this because of Seth. He has helped me. He's pulled me aside when there's been times where I think I actually can't do this. Seth has been my absolute rock through all of this. He's bombed me out for certain things. Mom, he's pulled me aside. Don't help Cayle. Let him do it on his own. He will ask you if he needs. That has really kept me going. Seth has been the one who's really kept me going through all of this. I have to say that. But I have two very strong boys, very close boys, and they've had moments over the years. I think we all do, all siblings do, he's irritating the heck out of me or whatever, but they are there for each other through thick and thin. And that's, even in the hospital in those early days, so many of the nurses, ITU nurses, used to say to me, your boys have got the most incredible relationship. When Cayle first came around, he couldn't speak, and Seth had gone in to see him. And as he turned round, just the huge grin on Cayle's face, the nurse just said it was the most incredible moment. And they've always been so close. And I think that's what has got us through, is how close we are, how supportive we are of each other.
100%. So this is all in the book that we've been alluding to, which is called One Step in a Poppy Field, the inspirational story of Lance Corporal Cayle Royce, MBE. So for those of our listeners that want to find out more about this, I will pop a link to the book in the description. Can highly recommend it. And that really just leaves me to say thank you, Bronwyn, for agreeing to do this, because I know it's not necessarily an easy thing to do, to tell this story, but I think your strength and determination, both yourself and your family, is commendable. And I thank you ever so much for doing this.
Oh, you're very welcome. If we can reach one person who needed to hear this story, that's what it's all about. Just give somebody hope. There is hope post-injury.
Absolutely. And not just the military world, because we talked about this before, didn't we? That, if this inspires anybody to try and achieve what might seem unachievable at the time, or even the small things in life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. You don't have to row an ocean like my child does. You just, any small thing which you feel you can't do or is a little bit out of your comfort zone, just give it a try, that's all we're asking.
I'm pretty relieved you've told me I don't need to row the Atlantic Ocean, because that would be that I can't and won't.
You don't know if you can't until you try.
Well, it's not going to happen. Thank you very much for the advice, but I'll politely decline. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks very much, Steve.
Well, I think that is a good a demonstration as we're going to get about how close and strong the bond between mother and son can be.
Yeah, and long may be it so. I mean, there's so many things that Bronwyn talks about that resonates so much with myself and like so many people that have served, and their partners and their mums, and the way she articulates it and tells it just, shows so much strength. And yeah, she's a strong woman, and she's a strong mum.
I think it also demonstrates that, behind, or beside, perhaps I should say, every service person, there is a family, whether it's an immediate family. And, there are often sacrifices that have to be made, not normally or hopefully as extreme as happened to Bronwyn's son. But I think it does show the importance of family within the armed forces community.
Yeah, and it's the importance of family, but I think that family doesn't necessarily have to be your traditional family. It's just those people that are next to kin, loved ones, are those people that are going to be there to give you support if you require it. But I think if you've been through traumatic injuries, you just need that. You need to have somewhere where you can get a hug, or, you can close the door and have your little, your moments yourself. And I was only from my friends, and I know, and I it's such a, if you haven't been there, it's a hard one to see. But to have somebody who is a bastion of strength like Bronwyn, and your mum as well. At the end of the day, I think Cayle's in a good position.
She showed remarkable strength and fortitude, I think, supported by her other son as well. And I think what a tight family unit we're talking here.
Yeah, I mean, like it helped having Cayle's brother Seth, who's a Royal Marine, obviously another serviceman and veteran, to be there. And even Bronwyn says that he was her support. He was the one that kept her on the straight and narrow, which again, it surprised me, because she shows continually so much strength. But to have that, even mum needs a bit of support, a bit of that as well. And I think because we are human beings and compassion and love, people write about it, people make films about it. That's what life, that's what makes the world go round. You know what I mean? Life, death, taxes maybe as well, but definitely love. And you think about it, in that experience that Cayle's went through, that has everything. It shows you all the compassion and love that a family unit gives through the trauma of him, being injured in a war environment, which is a lot of hate and there's a lot of death and destruction.
Yeah, a lot of death and destruction. But I think in some ways the family ordinarily are protected from that, because communications are very limited till, of course, something tragically happens.
Yeah, I mean, what Bronwyn came up with, and I think she said it was strength via logic. She said it wasn't logical. And her way of keeping the emotional, shall we say, burrs getting on her back was to say it wasn't logical. That wasn't logical. And I each, the reaction from loved ones to an injured person, they're all, circumstances are similar in a lot of respects, but because we're human beings, they're all completely different. There's different reactions, there's different family dynamics. There's so many things that are different but similar in a way. But her strength via logic, I latched onto that. I got that. I think that's it. That's something you gotta, because otherwise your emotion can overrun you, and you can become, we all have emotional moments, but possibly that could be the direction you pull on and go, no, that's not logical. Let's move back. Look at a bit of logic. like, the emotion can take over at some stage, but let's have a bit of logic and move it around. So I really did like what she showed. And also I think there's that strong South African culture, they're very resilient, they're very robust, they're expeditionary type, cultures that the resilience is, I think it's part of the culture, which can be quite scary for some people, but if it's part of you, then that they understand it more, they can deal with it probably in a better way.
So yes, she did talk about, processing it in a logical way, maybe to compartmentalize it, maybe to understand it. But she also has a very spiritual side to her, because she also talked about she knew when something had happened to Cayle, which is not necessarily a logical thing at all. And I think we were talking about this before we started recording, and it's kind of, if you kind of find your solace or spirituality wherever you find it, and that clearly was a moment for her, very much so.
Yeah, and I know, and I know you're not a believer, but it's that spiritual link, and if a mother knows type thing. And I have seen it so many times, and I don't, am I religious? Not really. Traditionally, possibly, but not religiously. But do I believe in faith and afterlife? And I put it to a lot of service people before they went on the ground on any operation or war fighting thing. Did they, if they were Christian, have a crucifix with them? If they were, Jewish, did they have a Star of David or whatever the religious belief was? Did they have a little word with their God and decide, for support? So it just shows you, is that a natural thing? Is it people that have never been Christians all of a sudden become Christians, or everyone who's never been a Muslim all of a sudden become Muslim? So, it's just one of those things that when it comes to that near-death experience, you see it in older people as well when it goes, before they get into hospice. I know I've got a close friend who works in a hospice, and she said that a lot of people do start, moving towards their beliefs and their gods, when they're close to death. And maybe it's a similar thing. Maybe it's just a naturalistic fear of what happens after. Do we just stop dead?
Crikey, I wasn't expecting the conversation to go this way. I think, it's about explaining what you can't rationalize, what you can't understand. And I think that's always been a very human thing to do, isn't it? To sort of, whatever era of society, or whichever society or whichever era we look at, there are different religions, there were multiple gods, Greek gods, so on and so forth. And I think we find comfort in so many ways, and some of those things might well be spiritual. I think that's up to the individual personally, and if it works for them, good for them.
Yeah, I mean, I do as well. But it's still the question, is it out there?
If any of our viewers would like to let us know.
But what you did say, which I remember completely, is the prevalence of blast injuries and being caught up with all the bacteria and dirt from the dust and grime and snot and bogies that are on the ground as the blast takes off, and how we developed our ballistic protection and personal protection, ballistic protection, to limit as best as possible the blast injuries with that ingraining, or the dust and the dirt and the bacteria that was able to penetrate and blast through the skin because of the intensity. And it's bizarre that all my friends that had blast injuries, this was the contamination and the infection post blast injuries was always prevalent. It happened in every case. You know what I mean? And it's I'm going to say reassuring. It's not reassuring, but it's just it seems it's exactly what happened in Cayle's case as well. But he got himself through, because apparently he was the best looking bloke this side of the Pagos Ridge in the hospital, by his mum's books, which I love to hear.
Well, I'm not going to argue with her about it.
Maybe it's part of that dark humour. I don't know.
He then obviously recovered. He had lost both legs above the knee, and then decided to go on a new adventure. So he rode the Atlantic with the team, and now he's very heavily involved in that side of things and other expeditions as well. He's certainly not a person to rest on his laurels, is he?
No, not at all. Like say, same person, trauma strengthens character and resolve. And that's what his mum came out with and said, or, I understood it as, and I'm going, yeah, I've seen that. And I've met Cayle on different evolutions, because he did one of his roads he did was with Lee Spencer, a good mate of mine, and I've caught up with him, and he's supporting and helping with the project, which is ongoing at the minute, is the Britain-Ukraine row for Ukraine rowing the Atlantic again with Lee. I think Kyle's in the support team crew for it, and we've got Andy Merry, beefeater in London, injured, MS of he's not suffer, he's MS, and he's obviously overcomer, are getting amongst it, and Lee Spencer and 2 Ukrainian amputees, and they're rowing the Atlantic in just in support of other Ukrainian veterans and Brit veterans, to see if we can get this ongoing and happening every year, because like I say, it's there are people that are in dire straits at the minute.
And there must be an awful lot of injured people coming, Ukrainians, as a result of the Ukrainian war. I mean, they don't publish their figures, but it must be big numbers, mustn't it?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, nobody's fully privy to what the extremes of the numbers are, but there are people suffering. I mean, and it's war. It's horrendous, and yeah, and it's sad. And there's so many places around globally where it is happening. Yeah, if we can change it, we've got to do that.
Yeah, I quite agree.
And like I say, it was good as well. Bronwyn was saying about because of her strength and what we've seen and what she was speaking about, she said she does have her emotional moments, and I think that happens with everyone, but especially after the journey she's been through with Cayle and what's happened to him. And she said that she's always, and she will be, because she's a mum, and those people that are parents will understand this, she'll always be worried about his mental health and his physical and mental well-being, and how he goes with it and deals with it. Because again, time heals wounds, but also time, stagnation, potentially being forgotten about, which we never want any of our veterans to happen, which we say in Remembrance Sunday, we will remember them. That's not only our loss, but that's our people that are injured. And I think we've got to, that's something that we've got to look ourselves in the mirror every day and make sure we do that to our friends and colleagues, and make sure that they're always part of our community, and keep it that way.
And maybe that's something we need to do a bit better as well, recognise the service of these recent conflicts, Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah,
I mean, it is, but it's one of those, it's a very hard thing to be, do we want sympathy? And I'm going, no, that's not what we're after. It's not sympathy. I think it's more of a society and community thing, just to make sure that we account for everyone. And that's not necessarily just veterans. That's let's think about all corners of society and community and reach out to them. But for those of us that are veterans, I think we've got to work extra harder to make sure we don't forget about our friends.
Yeah, well said, Tip.
Before you go, if you're a member of the Armed Forces community and need support with your mental health, Op Courage can help. Use the link in this podcast description for details. Or you can phone the Combat Stress Helpline on 0800 138 1619. If you'd like to contact us, email studio@companyofmakers.com.
Finally, we're giving a really big shout out to our funders. They support all the activities that we provide for the well-being of those who've served. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines Charity, Greenwich Hospital, Arts Council England, and the Armed Forces Covenant Fund Trust. Thank you.
This podcast was produced by Rachel Owen, hosted by Tip Cullen and me, recorded and edited by yours truly.
Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.